He had exactly 3 minutes to decide who would live and who would die. 34 hostages, 6 armed men, 1 waiter who was never supposed to be here. A man who had buried his old life alongside the woman he loved, who had sworn that the only battle left worth fighting was raising his 8-year-old daughter right. But the guns were real. The crying children were real. And somewhere deep in the muscle memory of Caleb Thorne, former Navy SEAL, something ancient and terrifying was already waking up. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where ordinary people find extraordinary courage when everything is on the line, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. It means everything to us to know how far these stories travel. Now sit back, because this one goes all the way. The reservation had been made 3 weeks in advance. Table 14, window seat. A birthday dinner for a couple celebrating their 32nd anniversary. The kind of reservation that Caleb Thorne had taken over the phone himself on a Tuesday afternoon, while his daughter Lily sat at the hostess stand doing her homework, swinging her legs off the edge of the stool because she was still 2 inches too short to touch the floor. He remembered that detail now, standing in the back corridor of Ardent, one of Chicago's most respected fine dining establishments, balancing 4 entrees on a tray that cost more per plate than most families spent on groceries in a week. He remembered Lily's legs swinging. He held that image the way a man holds a flashlight in a dark room. Not because it was useful, but because it was the only warm thing available. Table 6 needs their check, said Renata, slipping past him with a stack of dessert plates, her voice low and clipped the way it always was on a Saturday night when the floor was full and the kitchen was running 7 minutes behind. And the couple at 2 asked if the sommelier can come by again. I don't think they actually want wine. I think they just like the attention. I'll handle table 6, Caleb said. Tell Marcus he can skip 2 for now. Renata gave him a look that meant you always handle everything, and it's starting to get weird, but she didn't say it out loud because they had been working the same floor for 2 years, and she'd learned by now that Caleb Thorne didn't expand on things. He said what was necessary. He did what was needed. He went home at 11:15 every night to relieve the babysitter and check that Lily's nightlight was still plugged in, and he came back the next shift and did it again. That was the whole of it. That was the shape of the life he'd built from the wreckage of the one before. Ardent occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Michigan Avenue. The dining room was long and warm, lit by candles and carefully recessed ceiling fixtures that gave everything the quality of late afternoon light, regardless of the actual hour. The tables were dark walnut. The carpet was the color of charcoal. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the city at night, the lake black beyond the shore, the office towers stacked with their lit and unlit windows like scattered dominoes, the bridge lights reflected in broken lines on the river far below. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are, and Caleb moved through it the way he moved through most beautiful things, efficiently, without being particularly moved. He set the tray on the stand near table 6, distributed the plates with the automatic precision of someone who'd done the motion 10,000 times, recited the names of the dishes the way the manager had trained him to, and managed a brief, genuine smile when the older gentleman at the table said his halibut looked like a painting. It usually tastes better than it looks, Caleb told him, which made the man laugh. He was refilling the water glasses when the woman at table 14 caught his eye. Not because she was trying to. She wasn't looking at him at all. She was looking at her phone, one hand curved around a glass of sparkling water, the other scrolling with the focused efficiency of someone conducting business at the dinner table because there was no version of their life where business ever actually stopped. She was young, younger than most of the people who dined at Ardent, and she was dressed in the understated way of people who'd learned that real wealth didn't need to announce itself. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, a single thin bracelet on her left wrist. What caught his attention was the way 2 men at the bar were watching her. They weren't being obvious about it. In fact, they were doing a reasonable job of appearing not to watch her at all. One of them was nursing a whiskey and keeping his eyes on the middle distance. The other had his phone out and seemed to be texting. But Caleb had spent years in places where the difference between being watched and not being watched was the difference between coming home and not coming home. And the particular quality of attention those 2 men were paying to the woman at table 14 was not the attention of men who found her attractive. It was the attention of men who were waiting. He told himself he was imagining it. He refilled the last water glass, collected his tray, and walked back toward the service corridor. He told himself that twice. Her name was Vivian Ashford, though Caleb wouldn't learn that until later. She was 28 years old, and she ran a technology company called Lumen Systems that had, in the past 3 years, gone from a 40-person startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Wicker Park to a corporation with offices in 11 cities, an evaluation that made financial journalists describe her in terms typically reserved for people twice her age. She was the kind of person who appeared on magazine covers with headlines using words like visionary and relentless. And she had arrived at Ardent tonight for a dinner that had been arranged by her assistant, partly as a reward to herself for closing a deal that had consumed the better part of 8 months, and partly because she hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days, and her assistant had threatened to start telling investors about it. She was reading a contract amendment on her phone when she became aware of a change in the room. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was the absence of certain sounds, the cessation of silverware against porcelain, the interruption of conversational murmur, replaced by a quality of held breath that a room full of people produces when everyone in it receives the same information at the same moment. She looked up. The men came through both entrances simultaneously, the main entrance from the elevator lobby and the service entrance from the corridor near the kitchen. 4 through the front, 2 through the back. They were dressed in dark clothing, and they moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this before or rehearsed it enough times that it amounted to the same thing. The weapons they carried were not the kind of weapons that left room for negotiation. Someone screamed. Someone else knocked over a water glass. A child at the table by the window. A boy, maybe 6 years old, with his napkin still tucked into his shirt collar, started crying immediately, the way small children do, with total commitment and no self-consciousness whatsoever. Nobody move. The man who said it was standing near the host stand. He was broad through the shoulders and spoke with the flat authority of someone who had practiced the line. Phones on the tables, hands where I can see them. Anyone who makes this complicated will make it worse for everyone else. The dining room complied. 34 people, most of them reaching for their phones with shaking hands, most of them looking at each other with the wild, wide-eyed expression of people who have just discovered that the world they thought they were living in was not the actual world. Vivian set her phone face down on the table. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. Caleb was in the service corridor when he heard the first command. He stopped walking. He set the tray down on the nearest flat surface with a care that would have seemed strange to anyone watching, unhurried, deliberate, the way you set something down when you want both hands free. He stood very still for a moment. From the corridor, he could hear the reorganization of the room, the shuffle and scrape of chairs as people were instructed to move, the elevated pitch of someone crying, the barked repetitions of men trying to establish control over a space that still hadn't given it to them. He could see through the narrow rectangular window set into the service door. He looked, and then he started counting. 3 minutes and 14 seconds. That was how long Caleb Thorne stood in that corridor and did nothing except watch and count and think. Later, when people who hadn't been there tried to understand what he'd been doing, they would use words like calculating or strategizing, which were accurate enough but missed something essential. What he was really doing was something quieter and more fundamental than either of those words suggested. He was reading the room the way you read a language, not translating word by word, but absorbing it whole, letting the meaning arrive. 6 men. He confirmed that number quickly and then spent time he couldn't afford confirming it again because in his experience, the number you confirmed quickly was usually missing one. 6 men. He was right the first time. 2 were positioned near the entrance. Their job was to hold the door and prevent anyone from reaching the elevator. 1 was moving through the room collecting phones, which meant his weapon was holstered for the moment, which meant he was the most mobile and the most dangerous because he was the most unpredictable. 2 more were stationed near the windows, covering the room from opposite corners, with the overlapping fields of view that told Caleb these men had at least some training. The 6th was standing near the kitchen entrance, which suggested he was either guarding against escape through the kitchen or he was waiting for someone to arrive from that direction. Caleb watched the one near the kitchen. He watched him for 30 seconds. The man kept checking his watch. Waiting, then. Not guarding. Waiting for a signal. He shifted his attention to the hostages, 34 people. He'd counted them himself throughout the evening in the way he always counted. Not deliberately, but the way some people count stairs, out of habit so old it had become a reflex. He found them quickly, 4 tables near the window, 2 along the far wall, the anniversary couple at 14, the birthday party of 6 near the bar. And there, the table by the east window, the one he'd almost given to another party before the reservation came in, a family. Father, mother, 2 children. The boy who'd been crying had settled into a trembling silence with his face pressed against his mother's arm. His sister, who looked about Lily's age, was sitting with her back completely straight and her hands flat on the table, staring at nothing with the rigid stillness of a child who has decided that the way to be safe is to become invisible. 8 years old, maybe 9. Dark braids, a dress with small yellow flowers on it. Caleb had been a father for 8 years and a warrior for considerably longer, and in that moment, both of those things looked at the little girl with the yellow flowers and arrived at exactly the same conclusion. He looked at the man near the kitchen. The man checked his watch again. Caleb calculated. Not time. He'd stopped thinking about time as a resource the moment he'd started counting. He calculated what would happen next. The man near the kitchen was waiting for something, and whatever that something was, it would shift the dynamic in the room. And shifting dynamics were how hostage situations moved from bad to worse. You didn't wait for the dynamic to shift. You acted before the dynamic had a reason to. 6 men. He had no weapon. He had a service corridor, a partial wall, a wine cart positioned near the kitchen entrance, a hostage situation that was currently stable but wouldn't stay that way, and a little girl in a yellow flower dress sitting 10 feet from a man with a gun. He started moving. The woman at table 14 was watching the room, the way people watch things when their brain is still processing what's real. Vivian Ashford had built a company through a combination of intelligence and a willingness to sit with discomfort that most people couldn't tolerate. The discomfort of uncertainty, of incomplete information, of decisions that had to be made before all the facts were available. She understood, in a professional sense, that crisis required adaptation and that panic was the enemy of useful thought. Understanding that and actually achieving it were different things. She was frightened. She was more frightened than she could remember being since she was a child, and the fear had a physical quality. A cold pressure in her chest, a faint trembling in her legs that she was suppressing by pressing her feet flat against the floor, an awareness of her own breathing that made breathing feel difficult. She was watching the man near the kitchen when she noticed the door. The service door in the corridor just beyond the kitchen entrance moved a fraction of an inch. It was not a significant movement. It was the kind of movement that passed beneath most people's notice in most circumstances. And in circumstances like this, where every person in the room was trying hard not to look at anything that might draw attention, it was close to invisible. But Vivian was watching that particular section of wall because it was where the man with the watch was standing, and she had been watching him because he was the one who looked like he was waiting for something, and the door that moved a fraction of an inch was directly behind him. She pressed her feet harder against the floor. Nothing happened for a long moment. The man checked his watch. The child near the window shifted against his mother's arm. One of the hostage takers said something sharp to a man at the bar table who had moved slightly, and the room contracted inward in the way rooms do when violence becomes a specific possibility rather than a general threat. And then it happened. The man near the kitchen entrance looked down at his phone, just for a second and a half, maybe 2. The way you look at a phone when it vibrates and you need to confirm who's calling before you decide whether to answer. The service door opened. What happened in the next 12 seconds was something that most of the people in the room would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately and failing, because the human brain, under conditions of extreme stress, records events in fragments rather than sequences. And what they were witnessing was a sequence so compressed and precise that it defied the normal categories of before and after. The man near the kitchen was first and was also last, in the sense that by the time he understood something had happened, it was already over. He went down without a sound, which was the detail most witnesses would fixate on later, because silence was not what anyone expected. The man with the holstered weapon, the one moving through the room collecting phones, had time to turn. He had time to register that something had changed in the room's architecture of threat. He did not have time to do anything with that information. The two men at the windows. The two men at the door. 12 seconds. No shots fired. No one dead. The dining room was so quiet that Vivian could hear the hum of the city far below through the floor-to-ceiling glass. So became aware slowly that the man standing in the center of the room, breathing hard, his white waiter's shirt pulled loose from his trousers, a bruise already forming along his left cheekbone, was the same man who had refilled her water glass 40 minutes ago and said nothing particularly memorable while doing it. He was looking at the room. Not at her. At all of it. Taking inventory the same way he'd been taking inventory in that corridor, confirming what he needed to confirm. Then his eyes moved to the table by the east window, to the little girl in the yellow flower dress who had not moved, who was still sitting with her back straight and her hands flat on the table. Something in his face shifted. It wasn't relief exactly. It was closer to the thing that comes after relief, the moment when the body acknowledges that the specific thing it was afraid of did not happen, and tries to recalibrate around that fact. He pulled his shirt back into his waistband. He straightened his collar. He looked around the room once more, and then he walked toward the phone that one of the hostage takers had dropped near table 9, picked it up, and dialed. "This is Caleb Thorne," he said when someone answered. "I'm at Ardent Restaurant, 14th floor, 825 North Michigan. You need to send units now. 6 individuals, all incapacitated. No casualties among the hostages. The room is secure, but I need medical for at least one person with a possible head injury." A pause. "No, I'm a waiter. Just send the units." He hung up. He set the phone on the nearest table. Someone started crying. Not the frightened crying from earlier, but the different kind. The kind that comes when the body finally gets permission to release what it's been holding. Then someone began to clap. A single pair of hands, uncertain at first. And then others joined. And then the sound filled the room, the way sounds fill a space that has been holding its breath. Caleb Thorne stood in the middle of it looking faintly uncomfortable. He found the anniversary couple at table 14. Not Vivian's table, the original table 14, the birthday reservation, the one that had started this whole evening, and he walked over to where the older gentleman was sitting with his wife, both of them pale and shaken and holding each other's hands across the walnut tabletop. "I'm sorry about your dinner," Caleb said. The man looked at him for a long moment. "Son," he said, and his voice cracked on the word in the way old men's voices crack when something has moved them past the point where dignity feels like the most important thing. "I think you just gave us the best anniversary we've ever had." Caleb almost smiled. It got about halfway there. He turned to check on the little girl with the yellow flowers, who had finally let go of her stillness and was now crying into her mother's shoulder with the complete and total relief of a child who had held herself together for as long as she possibly could and had run out of reasons to keep trying. Her father was holding both of them. His eyes, when they found Caleb's across the room, said everything that words in any language would have been too small to carry. Caleb looked away. He wasn't good at that part. He'd never been good at that part. He walked to the window instead and stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city, the lake, the lights, the bridge reflections on the dark river, waiting for the police to arrive, letting the room settle around him, already tired in a way that had nothing to do with the last 12 seconds and everything to do with the 4 years before them. Behind him, the room hummed with the complicated sound of people who had survived something together and were only beginning to understand what that meant. At table 14, the real one, the window seat, the one he'd taken the reservation for on a Tuesday afternoon while Lily's legs swung above the floor, Vivian Ashford had not joined the applause. She had not cried. She sat with her hands still flat on the table, watching the man at the window, and she was thinking with the focused clarity she normally reserved for her work, turning over what she'd seen, filing it carefully, because she had the instinct, she couldn't have told you where it came from, that what had happened in this room tonight was not finished, that it was in some way she couldn't yet identify, only beginning. The police arrived in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Caleb counted that too, without meaning to. It was the kind of thing his brain did on its own now, the same way other people's brains filled in song lyrics or noticed when a picture frame was crooked. Everything got measured. Everything got filed. He'd stopped fighting it a long time ago. He was sitting in one of the upholstered chairs that the restaurant kept near the host stand, the kind of chair designed to make waiting feel like a choice, when the first officers came through the elevator doors. They moved the way officers always moved into an uncertain room, weapons not drawn but hands ready, eyes doing the same sweep Caleb had done 45 minutes earlier, though with considerably less urgency since the situation had already resolved itself into something they could manage. The lead detective found him quickly. Caleb suspected that was partly because he was the only person in the room who wasn't either crying or talking very fast. "You're Thorne?" the detective said. His name was Garza. He was somewhere in his late 40s, carrying the particular weariness of a man who'd seen enough that almost nothing surprised him anymore, though something about the current scene was clearly testing that. "Yes." Garza looked at the 6 men zip-tied on the floor near the kitchen entrance. Then he looked at Caleb. "You did this?" "Nobody else was doing it." Garza pulled out his notebook. "I'm going to need you to walk me through what happened." "I'll walk you through it as many times as you need," Caleb said. "But there are children in this room who've been sitting in those chairs for close to an hour. Can we get them out first?" Garza looked at him for a beat. Then he turned to the officers behind him and said something Caleb didn't catch, and within 2 minutes the family by the east window was being guided toward the elevator, the mother with her arms around both children, the father looking back once at Caleb with that same expression from before. Caleb looked at the floor. The interview took 40 minutes. Caleb told it straight, without embellishment or false modesty, which he'd found over the years was both the most honest approach and the most efficient. He'd been in the service corridor. He'd observed the room. He'd identified a tactical window when the 6th operative looked at his phone and acted on it. "Operative," Garza repeated, writing. "Sorry. Attacker." "No," Garza said slowly. "I think operative is probably the right word." He studied Caleb for a moment. "Navy SEAL, that's what they're saying. That was a while ago." "You don't unlearn that." "No," Caleb agreed. "You don't." Garza wrote something else. "The attackers. You said the one near the kitchen was waiting for a signal. He kept checking his watch, not the nervous kind, the coordinated kind. Like something was supposed to happen at a specific time and he needed to stay on schedule. Any idea what that something was?" Caleb had his own thoughts about that. He kept them to himself for now. "That's your job, detective." Garza almost smiled. "Fair enough." They were wrapping up when one of the younger officers approached and bent down to say something quietly into Garza's ear. Garza's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. He closed his notebook and looked at Caleb with slightly different eyes. "Sit tight for another few minutes," he said. "There's someone who needs to talk to you." He walked away before Caleb could ask who. Caleb sat in the chair and waited, and after about 3 minutes, Vivian Ashford sat down in the chair across from him. She'd been with 2 plainclothes officers in the far corner of the room for most of the past half hour, and whatever they'd been telling her had left a mark. Not on her face, exactly, because she had the kind of face that didn't give things away easily, but in the way she held herself, a tightening through the shoulders that hadn't been there when she was just a woman reading a contract at a window table. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You refilled my water glass," she finally said. "Twice." It was a slow night before everything happened. "You didn't say anything, either time. Most waiters say something. I figured you were working. People don't need conversation when they're working. They need water." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, more like the recognition of one. "My name is Vivian Ashford." "I know. They told me." He paused. "Caleb Thorne." "I know that too." She folded her hands in her lap. They were still now, which he suspected took effort. "I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to." "I'm going to anyway." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it, a pressure she was maintaining control over the way you maintain control over a car on ice, not by gripping harder, but by refusing to overcorrect. "What you did in there, I've been trying to find a way to describe it to myself since it happened, and I can't. It doesn't need a description. It's done. For you, maybe." He didn't have an answer to that, so he didn't try to manufacture one. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the window, at the city below. "They told me something," she said. "The officers. About why those men were here tonight." "What did they tell you?" "That it wasn't random." She turned back to him. Her eyes were darker than he'd noticed before, or maybe it was the light. Or maybe it was just what the evening had done to her. That I was the reason they were here. Caleb said nothing, because he'd already suspected that from the moment he'd seen the two men at the bar watching her, and he wasn't sure what comfort he could offer that wouldn't feel manufactured. They said there's an investigation, Vivian continued, that the men who came here tonight are connected to a criminal organization, that the organization has reason to want... She stopped, started again. That I'm in possession of evidence, encrypted files. A former employee transferred them to my company's servers 8 months ago before he disappeared. I didn't know what they contained. I still don't know exactly, but apparently whoever these people work for does know, and they've known for long enough to plan this. Have you told the investigators where the files are? They have them now, but apparently that doesn't solve the problem. She paused. The copies that exist can testify, so to speak, without me. But the people who want them destroyed may not know that, or may not care. Which means you're still a target. That seems to be the consensus, yes. She said it with the flat pragmatism of someone who'd learned to look at bad news directly because looking away didn't make it smaller. I run a technology company. I have a security team. 12 people, very competent. But the officers tonight were not encouraging about whether competent is the same thing as sufficient. Caleb looked at his hands. There was a cut on his right knuckle, not deep, that he'd gotten from the second man near the window. He hadn't noticed it until right now. Why are you telling me this? He said. She held his gaze steadily. Because I want to offer you a job. The dining room had mostly emptied by now. Hostages processed and released, officers cataloging the scene, the 6 men loaded into vehicles downstairs. The restaurant without its people had the specific silence of a space that was accustomed to noise, every surface and angle shaped around the expectation of sound. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. She didn't react the way people usually reacted to no. She didn't push back immediately, didn't try to recalibrate the pitch. She just nodded, once, slowly, like she'd taken the word in and was turning it over. Can I ask why? Because I have a daughter. She's 8. I made a decision 4 years ago about what kind of life she would have, and it didn't include this. This, Vivian said carefully. This. He gestured at the room. The zip-tied men being photographed by forensics, the overturned water glass that nobody had righted, the napkin still folded into a bird shape at a table where 2 people had been eating their anniversary dinner 2 hours ago. Whatever this leads to, I'm done with it. Vivian looked at the room too, and for a moment they were both just looking at the evidence of what the evening had become. Your daughter, she said, what's her name? He considered not answering. Lily. She nodded, didn't push on it. Whatever she was, she understood where doors were. I'm sorry, she said, and it sounded like she meant it in a larger sense than just the immediate one. I understand. She stood, straightened her jacket, and reached into her blazer pocket. She set a business card on the chair arm beside him, white, minimal, just her name and a number. If you change your mind, or if there's anything I can do for you. A beat. Thank you, Caleb, for what you did in there. I mean it. She walked away. He watched her go, then looked at the card, then left it on the chair and went to find his jacket in the back corridor. He got home at 12:40 instead of 11:15. The babysitter, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Okafor, who lived on the second floor and had strong opinions about punctuality, was asleep in the armchair with a paperback open on her chest. He woke her gently, apologized, tipped her an extra 20 that she refused, and he pressed on her anyway. Then he went down the hall and stood in the doorway of Lily's room. She was asleep on her side, one arm around the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2. Her nightlight was still on. The room smelled like the strawberry shampoo she'd recently decided was the only acceptable shampoo for reasons she'd declined to fully explain. He stood there for a while. He didn't go in. He just stood in the doorway with his shoulder against the frame and looked at her and let the reality of her settle over him the way it always did. That weight, that specific and irreplaceable weight, the only thing in the world he was completely certain he would die for without a second of hesitation. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did. 2 days passed. On the first day, the story broke across every news platform in Chicago and several national outlets. Restaurant hostage situation, 14 floors above Michigan Avenue. All hostages safe, 6 men in custody. A waiter who'd handled it alone in 12 seconds. The reporters couldn't find Caleb because he didn't have social media and his address wasn't public, and his manager at Ardent, a quietly decent man named Bernard, who'd been running the floor for 11 years, told them with great sincerity that he had absolutely no information to share. On the second day, Detective Garza called. Caleb was at the kitchen table with Lily's school schedule and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, trying to figure out whether he could make Thursday's parent-teacher conference work around his shift. He looked at the phone number for a moment before answering. They identified the organization, Garza said, without opening pleasantries. We weren't sure at first because they use a lot of corporate wrapping, shell companies, consulting fronts, things that look legitimate from outside and don't look like anything from inside if you don't know what you're looking at. But the 6 men from the restaurant all came back to the same network. We're calling them ARCA internally. It's not their name for themselves, it's just what we're using. What do they do? The short answer? Everything. Fraud, extortion, trafficking of multiple kinds, contract work for other organizations that don't want their hands dirty. They've been operating in the Midwest and along the Eastern Corridor for about 12 years. They're very good at not being seen. Garza paused. The files on Ashford's server. We've been working with federal partners to decrypt them. What we're finding is substantial. Financial records, communication logs, names of facilitators inside legitimate companies and agencies. If this goes to trial with that evidence intact, ARCA loses most of its operational leadership. Caleb was quiet. That's why she was targeted, Garza continued. Not just to destroy the evidence, to destroy the only person in a position to authenticate it in a way that holds up in court. Her former employee who transferred the files is dead. Ruled an accident, but we're revisiting that. She's the last link in the chain. You're telling me this because you want something, Caleb said. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you walked into the other night. Another pause. But yes, I'm also telling you because something came up this morning that you need to hear. Caleb looked at Lily's school schedule on the table. The parent-teacher conference was Thursday at 3:15. Tell me, he said. We've been monitoring communication traffic connected to ARCA since the restaurant. This morning, one of our analysts flagged a surveillance image. It was taken 3 days ago, before the restaurant, outside Westbrook Elementary in Lincoln Park. Caleb's hand tightened on the phone. The image shows a man we've now identified as a known ARCA operative, Garza said. He's photographing the school. The angle of the photograph suggests he's specifically capturing the parent pickup area and the side gate that the after-school program uses. Say it straight, Caleb said. His voice came out level. He was surprised by that. They know about your daughter, Garza said. We don't know how, but they know. It's possible they ran background on everyone present at the restaurant after the first attempt failed. It's possible they knew about you before that. Your service record is technically classified, but nothing stays truly classified. Either way, they know. Caleb sat very still. Through the kitchen window, the back alley behind the building looked exactly like it always looked. Dumpsters, fire escapes, a neighbor's bicycle chained to the railing, pigeons on the utility wire. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything the same as yesterday. Nothing the same as yesterday. What do I do? He said, and it wasn't really a question. That's not my department, Garza said quietly. But I know a woman who called my unit this morning asking whether there was any update on your situation. I told her I'd pass along whatever I could. Caleb looked at the business card on the kitchen counter. He'd told himself he'd thrown it away at the restaurant. He hadn't. I'll call you back, he said to Garza, and hung up. He sat at the table for a long time. The coffee was fully cold now. Outside, one of the pigeons left the utility wire, and the others rearranged themselves around the empty space. He thought about Lily. He thought about the little girl in the yellow flowered dress, the way she'd sat so still with her hands flat on the table, the way she'd finally broken when it was safe to. He thought about the specific kind of discipline that took, the kind that small children shouldn't have to discover they possess. Lily had never had to hold herself that still. He had made choices, deliberately and at considerable cost, to make sure she never had to. He picked up the business card. He dialed. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been expecting the call, which told him she was as smart as everything else about her suggested. Caleb, she said. I'll take the job, he said, but I have conditions. Tell me. Lily comes first, always. If her safety and your security ever conflict, there's no conflict. She wins. Understood. I run my own team. I don't answer to a committee. I don't justify my decisions to your board. And I don't slow walk anything because someone in a suit is uncomfortable with the speed. I'll back you completely. You don't know what that will cost yet. I know enough, Vivian said. There was something in her voice that wasn't confidence exactly. It was the sound of someone who'd been frightened and had decided that being frightened wasn't the same as being wrong about what needed to happen. I know what you did in that dining room, and I know you didn't have to do it. I know you're making this decision for your daughter and not for me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Whatever you need to keep her safe, I will provide it. Caleb looked at the school schedule on the table. Thursday, 3:15. I need to pick my daughter up from school at 3:15 on Thursday, he said. A pause. Then, I'll make sure everything is arranged. One more thing. Yes. Find out everything your company has on Arca. Every document, every server log, every communication from the employee who sent you those files. I want it all before Monday morning. There was a brief silence on her end, not hesitation but something more like recalibration. The adjustment of someone who'd expected negotiation and had received a field order instead. You'll have it by Sunday night, she said. He hung up. He looked at the card in his hand for a moment, then set it back on the counter. Then he walked down the hall to Lily's room, which she'd left with characteristic 8-year-old disorder. Books half open on the floor, markers without caps, the stuffed elephant sitting in the desk chair with a paper crown taped to its head, apparently having been recently crowned for reasons Caleb had not been updated on. He picked up the markers and capped them. He stacked the books. He adjusted the paper crown on the elephant's head so it sat straight. He straightened up and looked at the room around him. The drawings on the wall, the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that he'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon sticking up there while Lily directed him from below with the seriousness of an architect overseeing a construction crew. He had promised himself 4 years ago, standing in a hospital hallway with his whole life rearranged beyond recognition, that he would not go back. That the life before, the training and the missions and the long stretches of managed violence in places most people would never see, was over. That Lily deserved a father who came home, who was present, who was not carrying a version of himself she would never fully know. He had kept that promise for 4 years. He had tended it carefully, the way you tend something fragile. But there was a man in a photograph outside her school. There was a criminal organization that had decided his daughter was a useful pressure point. And Caleb had learned, in years of operating in the spaces between law and chaos, that the only thing worse than being a target was being a target who was still pretending he wasn't one. You could choose to be done with violence. You could not choose whether violence was done with you. He turned off Lily's light, left the door half open the way she liked it, and went to make himself a fresh cup of coffee. There was a great deal of work to do, and he intended to start before morning. What? The Lumen Systems headquarters occupied 8 floors of a tower in the West Loop, the kind of building that looked from the outside like an architect had tried to make glass feel warm, with moderate success. Caleb arrived on Monday morning at 7:40, which was 40 minutes before the time Vivian's assistant had specified, because he always arrived 40 minutes early to anything he needed to understand. He spent those 40 minutes in the lobby, watching. Security desk staffed by 2 guards, neither of whom checked credentials with any particular rigor. 3 cameras visible from where he stood, which meant at least 2 he couldn't see. Elevator bank with keycard access, but a bypass that he identified in 4 minutes by watching how the cleaning crew moved. Fire exit on the east side with a push bar that, based on the floor gap, hadn't fully seated in its frame in some time. By the time Vivian's assistant, a precise young man named Derek, who moved at the speed of someone perpetually 15 minutes behind, appeared to collect him, Caleb had a working mental map of every vulnerability in the building's ground floor. It was not a short list. Vivian was on the 6th floor in a corner office that was less ostentatious than he'd expected. A large desk, 1 good couch, 1 wall of windows, shelves of technical books, and a few framed photographs that he didn't look at closely because they weren't his business. She was standing when he came in, which he appreciated. He didn't like rooms where people stayed seated to make a point about who was in charge. She'd brought 2 other people, a woman named Sue Yeon Park, who ran Lumen's existing security team, compact, watchful, with the composed expression of someone who'd spent the weekend bracing for this meeting, and a man named Elliot Marsh from the company's legal team, who had the look of a person who managed difficult things by translating them into language that other difficult things couldn't argue with. "Before we start," Caleb said, setting his jacket over the back of the chair, but not sitting down, "I want to be clear about something. I'm not here to audit what you've built. I'm here because what you've built isn't sufficient for the current threat, and I'm going to need the authority to change things quickly and without a committee review on every decision." Soo-yeon Park said nothing, but the set of her jaw shifted. "That doesn't mean your team doesn't know what they're doing," Caleb continued, looking at her directly. "It means the situation has moved faster than any existing system was designed for. I've read the files. I know what ARCA is capable of, and I know how they operate, and I can tell you right now that 3 of your current security protocols have identifiable gaps that their people would find within 48 hours. A silence. "Which 3? Park said. Her voice was even and professional. "Vendor access, server room physical entry, and the side loading bay on the building's north face that your protocols treat as a secondary concern." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "The loading bay has been flagged internally for 6 months. "Then we start there," Caleb said. Vivian was watching this exchange without intervening, which he noted. She'd brought these people into the room and then stepped back from it, which was either a test or an instinct. "I thought it was probably both." "There's something else," Vivian said. She moved to the desk and opened a folder, physical paper, which he also noted, because people who dealt with sensitive information often trusted paper more than screens. "The files from Marcus Webb, the former employee. I read what you sent. There's something not in what I sent." She slid a single printed page across the desk toward him. "This came in through our anonymous tip system on Saturday night. We can't verify the source, but our analysts spent 2 days checking the specific technical claims it contains, and they're accurate." He picked up the page and read it. The tip described a secondary network within ARCA, not operational leadership but structural, embedded in legitimate companies, financial institutions, and at least 2 law enforcement-adjacent agencies. A network designed specifically to protect the organization's leadership from exposure by ensuring that any investigation that got too close encountered friction from within. It identified a specific internal term ARCA used for this network. They called it the lining. Caleb set the page down. "This changes the timeline we're set," he said. "I know. If they have people inside legitimate agencies, then law enforcement coordination is compromised. We can't assume that everything we share with investigators stays contained." "I know," Vivian said again. She was looking at him with the steady, uncomfortable directness of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. "Which means this company, for the moment, is largely on its own." Caleb looked at the page again. Then at the window, at the West Loop outside, the street below, the ordinary Monday morning traffic of a city that had no idea what was running underneath it. He thought about Garza, about whether Garza was inside the lining or outside it, and about the fact that he genuinely didn't know and couldn't assume either way, and that operating in that kind of uncertainty was something he'd done before, in places far less comfortable than a corner office in Chicago. He thought about Lily, who at this moment was sitting in her 3rd-grade classroom doing something with fractions that she'd complained about extensively at breakfast, unaware that her father was standing in a tower in the West Loop, restructuring the architecture of his entire life around the fact that someone had pointed a camera at her school. "All right," he said. He pulled out the chair and sat down, which was his way of indicating that the preliminary part of the conversation was over. "Show me everything you have. Start with the files from Webb and work forward. I want every name, every date, every financial transaction you've been able to map. And I want to know exactly who inside this company has had access to those files since they arrived on your servers." Vivian nodded to Derek, who left the room and returned 2 minutes later with a laptop and 3 thick physical binders that landed on the table with the weight of something that had been accumulating for a long time and was only now arriving at the moment where it would have to be dealt with. Caleb opened the first binder. He looked at the first page. Then he looked up at Vivian, who was watching him the way she'd watched him from table 14, carefully, with that quality of attention that filed things rather than merely observed them. "Close the door," he said to Derek. Derek closed it, and they began. The first week inside Lumen Systems taught Caleb 3 things: The first was that the company's existing security team was better than he'd initially given them credit for. Su Yeon Park ran a disciplined operation, regular protocol reviews, solid incident documentation, a genuine culture of reporting rather than covering. The problem wasn't competence. The problem was that the team had been built to handle corporate threats, disgruntled employees, data theft, the occasional aggressive competitor. They had not been built for ARCA. The second thing he learned was that Vivian Ashford worked harder than anyone else in the building and was aware that people knew this and was faintly uncomfortable about it, which was an unusual quality in someone who ran a company worth what hers was worth. He'd catch her in the office at 6:30 in the morning when he arrived for his own early walkthroughs, and she'd look up from whatever she was reading with the expression of someone who'd been caught doing something slightly embarrassing, and then she'd offer him coffee from the machine on her credenza that made a noise like a small animal in distress, but apparently produced acceptable results. He always said yes to the coffee. It gave him a reason to stand in the room for a few minutes and brief her on whatever he'd found in the previous 24 hours, which she received the way she received most information, quietly, thoroughly, without interrupting. The third thing he learned was that the building had a leak. He didn't know where it was yet. He knew it existed because 3 times in the first week, operational decisions that had been made in rooms containing no more than 6 people showed up, in altered form, laundered through enough intermediary steps to obscure the path, in places they shouldn't have been. A vendor contract that had been quietly changed got flagged by a competitor's attorney who couldn't have known about the original terms unless someone told them. A meeting that had been moved for security reasons was met with an attempt to access the original location by someone presenting fraudulent credentials. Small things. The kind of things that could be explained away individually as coincidence or procedural failure. Caleb did not believe in coincidence. He believed in pattern. He didn't tell Vivian about this immediately, which was a choice he made deliberately and was not comfortable with. He needed to know more before he named it, because naming a leak in a company created its own kind of damage. It turned every room into a room of suspects, and people who felt suspected made decisions from fear rather than reason, and fear was ARCA's preferred operating environment. Instead, he started feeding different information to different people. Not lies. He was careful about that. Small variations. A meeting time slightly different in one person's calendar than another's. A vendor name mentioned in a briefing that wasn't mentioned in the corresponding written summary. The kind of discrepancies that were invisible, unless you were looking for the signal they'd generate downstream. He was patient about it. He'd been patient about harder things. On Friday of the second week, Elliot Marsh from Legal found him in the security office on the 4th floor, which was where Caleb had established his working base because it had 2 exits, no external windows, and sat directly above the server room, which meant he could feel the vibrations if anything changed in the physical infrastructure below. Marsh was carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of a man who'd found something he didn't want to have found. "Close the door," Caleb said, without looking up from the access log he was reviewing. Marsh closed it. "We have a problem." "Tell me." "Gregory Voss." Caleb looked up. Gregory Voss was Lumen's chief operating officer, a 15-year veteran of the company who'd been with Vivian from the early days when the company was still operating out of the warehouse in Wicker Park. He was 53, well-liked, competent. He'd been in 3 of the 6 rooms where the decisions had leaked. "What about him?" Caleb said. Marsh set the tablet on the desk. On the screen was a financial record, an account and a name Caleb didn't recognize, but the account structure was familiar because he'd spent 2 weeks staring at the financial architecture in Marcus Webb's files. And ARCA used a specific method of layering shell accounts that left a recognizable residue if you knew what you were looking for. "His brother-in-law," Marsh said. "The account is technically his brother-in-law's, but the transaction patterns go back 18 months, and—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "And 3 of the deposits correspond within 48 hours to the operational decisions that were compromised." Caleb looked at the record for a long time. "Does anyone else know about this?" he said. "No, I came directly to you." "Keep it that way. Don't go back to your office and write this up. Don't tell your assistant. Don't tell anyone on your team." Marsh nodded. He looked ill. "How long have you known Voss?" Caleb asked. 12 years. He came to my wedding." A pause. "He came to my son's christening." Caleb didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. He'd been here before, not in a corporate context, but the shape of the discovery was the same. The moment you confirmed that the person inside the wire was someone you trusted, and the confirmation felt worse than the suspicion had. Go back to your desk, Caleb said. Behave normally. Can you do that? Yes. Are you sure? Marsh looked at him with tired eyes. I've been a corporate lawyer for 22 years. Behaving normally while being deeply unhappy is essentially the job description. Caleb almost said something to that. He let it go. Go. Marsh left. Caleb sat with the tablet for a moment, then picked up his phone. He did not call Vivian. Not yet. Instead, he called a man named Ray Dexter, who had been in Caleb's SEAL team for 6 years and now ran a private investigative firm out of Indianapolis that was technically licensed to operate in Illinois. Ray answered on the first ring, which was Ray's way. He'd always had the quality of someone who was already awake when you called, regardless of the hour. I need a secondary watch on Gregory Voss, Caleb said, COO at Lumen Systems. Starting tonight. I need his communications, his movements, his contacts, everything in the last 90 days if you can reconstruct it. That's a short timeline for 90 days. I know, do what you can. What am I looking for? A relationship with people he shouldn't have a relationship with. You'll know it when you find it. When do you need this? Yesterday, Caleb said. But I'll settle for Monday. He hung up. Then he sat in the security office in the hum of the server room below and thought about Lily, the way he always came back to thinking about Lily when the work got hard, because she was the fixed point that kept everything else oriented. She'd had a good week. He'd managed dinner at home 4 out of 5 nights, which was better than he'd managed in the final years of his military career when home was a concept that existed mostly in theory. She'd shown him a drawing she'd made at school of their apartment building, and she'd included in it, on the roof, 2 small figures that she'd labeled Dad and ME, looking out at a city that she'd rendered with complete geographic confidence and 0 geographic accuracy, and he'd put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Illinois, and she'd looked at it for a long moment and said, "The river's in the wrong place, but I think the feeling is right." He'd laughed, a real one, and she'd looked pleased with herself in the way she did when she'd said something that landed. He carried that with him, now. Into the rooms where the work was ugly. The feeling is right. Voss confirmed himself on Sunday. Ray sent the communication records at 11 in the evening, and Caleb sat at his kitchen table after Lily was in bed and went through them carefully, the way he'd gone through the binders in Vivian's office, without rushing, letting the picture assemble itself rather than forcing it. The relationship had started not 18 months ago, as the financial records suggested, but nearly 3 years back. A contact initiated through what appeared to be a business introduction, a consulting firm that Caleb recognized from Marcus Webb's files as a known ARCA front. Voss had been careful. The communications were indirect, often routed through the brother-in-law, sometimes through a third party, whose only apparent function was to create distance between origin and destination. But patterns were patterns, and Ray Dexter was very good at finding them. What Voss had been providing wasn't just operational intelligence. He'd been providing personnel records, access credentials, the architecture of Lumen's internal network. Caleb read that twice. If ARCA had the network architecture, they could place people inside the building's systems without appearing on any external access log. Not hackers, physical people, using credentials that looked legitimate because they'd been drawn from legitimate sources. Contractors. Vendors. The kind of people who moved through corporate buildings in the margins of the workday and whom nobody looked at carefully because there was no visible reason to. He went back through the vendor access logs for the past 6 weeks. It took him until 2 in the morning. By the time he found it, he was on his 4th cup of coffee, and the city outside was quiet in the way it only gets after midnight, when even Chicago runs low on reasons to be loud. 3 individuals, all listed as HVAC maintenance contractors through a vendor company called Meridian Technical Services. All 3 had accessed restricted floor levels, floors 4 through 6, where the server room, the security office, and Vivian's office were located in the past 3 weeks. Meridian Technical Services had a business license that checked out on the surface. When Caleb dug one layer deeper, the company had been incorporated 11 months ago, had no physical headquarters, and listed as its registered agent a law firm that appeared in Marcus Webb's files as a known facilitator for Arca's corporate structures. He called Park. She answered in 2 rings. It was 2:20 in the morning. She didn't sound like she'd been asleep, which told him something about what kind of person she was. I need you to pull every badge access record for Meridian Technical Services going back 60 days, he said. Every floor they accessed, every time window, every badge number. Don't run this through the main security system. Do it directly from the raw log file. A beat. How fast? I'm coming in at 5. Have it ready. Caleb? Her voice shifted slightly. How bad is this? He considered how honest to be. Bad enough that we handle it tonight and not tomorrow. She was already moving. He could hear it in the background sounds. I'll be there at 4:30. He hung up. He sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet, looking at his hands on the table, thinking about the 3 men who had walked through Lumen's restricted floors with legitimate-looking credentials while he was sitting in the same building learning what he was up against. He was angry. He let himself be angry for about 45 seconds, which was the time it took to finish his coffee, and then he set the feeling aside and started writing. He told Vivian on Monday morning, all of it, Voss, the vendor infiltration, the network architecture breach, what it meant for the timeline and the threat level. He told it straight, the same way he'd told Garza the events of the restaurant. No softening, no strategic withholding, just the facts in the order they'd assembled themselves. She listened without interrupting. She was standing at her office window with her coffee, looking at the street below, and she didn't move while he talked. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he wondered if she needed more time, and then she said without turning around, "How long has Gregory been doing this?" "Close to 3 years, based on what I can confirm. Possibly longer." A pause. "He was with us from the beginning. He helped me write the original business plan." "I know. He hired most of the people in this building." "I know that too." She turned around. Her face was composed, which he recognized by now as what it looked like when she was doing something that cost her something, containing a thing that was real and large by sheer force of the discipline she'd spent years developing. "What do I do?" "Nothing visible. Not yet. If we move on Voss now, we lose the ability to feed Arca bad information through the channel he's given them. We need to use him before we close him." He paused. "Can you do that? Sit across from him in meetings and let him think the pipeline is still open?" She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to name. "You're asking me to deceive someone I've trusted for 12 years. "Yes." "While knowing what he's done." "Yes." She looked out the window again. "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. She nodded once and didn't say anything else about it, and he understood that the conversation on that subject was finished. Not because it didn't matter, but because she'd made her decision and there was no use in continuing to stand in the doorway of it. "The contractors," she said, "the 3 men from Meridian. Park is already handling it. We're rotating which floors they have access to, keeping them away from anything genuinely sensitive while making it look like normal scheduling. We're also watching where they go when they leave the building." "Have they placed anything in the building?" "Park found 2 devices on the 6th floor. We left them in place." Vivian absorbed that. "They've been listening." "Yes." "To what?" "To what we've been saying near those specific locations." He paused. "Which is why I've been having certain conversations in the security office and not in your office or the conference room." She stared at him. "You knew." "I suspected. I needed to confirm before I told you because I needed to know the extent of it." She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Is there anything else in this building I should know about?" "Not yet. I'll tell you when there is." She exhaled. Not dramatically. It was a controlled thing, a small release of pressure, the kind of breath that marked the transition between absorbing bad news and beginning to act on it. "What do you need from me?" "Access to Webb's complete file. Not the summary you sent me, the original. Everything he had before he transferred it to your servers. I think there's something in the source data that we've been working around the edges of without seeing directly. I'll have Derek get you the access codes." "Tell Derek nothing about why." She nodded. He stood to leave and she said, "Caleb," in a way that made him stop. "Yeah." "Lily, is she... She's fine. I've had someone on the school since Garza called me." He paused. "She doesn't know. I'd like to keep it that way." "Of course." A beat. "She sounds like someone worth all of this." She is, he said, and left. The third week was when it broke open. Ray called on a Wednesday afternoon while Caleb was in the middle of reviewing the reconstructed access logs with Park, and the tone of his voice in the first 2 seconds told Caleb to step into the hallway. The third contractor, Ray said. Meridians. His name is Vincent Kale. He's not an HVAC technician. I know. What you don't know is that Kale has been active for ARCA for 9 years. He's not logistics. He's not intelligence. Ray paused. He's the kind of asset organizations like this use when they've decided that a problem needs to be resolved permanently rather than managed. Caleb stood in the hallway outside the security office with the phone pressed to his ear and the sounds of the building's ordinary afternoon functioning around him. Someone's printer, a conversation at the far end of the floor, the elevator chiming. Where is he now? Caleb said. That's the other part. Ray's voice was careful, the way it got when he was delivering something he'd checked 3 times before saying, he hasn't been seen at Lumen in 4 days, but he was photographed this morning. Where? Outside Westbrook Elementary. Everything in Caleb went very still. The photo came in through a contact of mine at 6 this morning, Ray continued. Cale was there during the morning drop-off. He had a clear line of sight to the side gate. The side gate. Where Lily's class came out at the end of the day, because her classroom was at the back of the building and the side gate was closer. Is my person still on the school? Caleb said. His voice was steady. He had no idea how. I checked before I called. Yes, she's there. Tell her to pull back to visual distance and call me immediately if Cale shows up again. Don't approach him. Don't alert him. Already done. Ray. Yeah. Get me everything on Cale. Everything. Tonight. You'll have it by 8. He hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer, looking at nothing, breathing in a controlled and deliberate way that he'd learned in circumstances designed to require it. Then he went back into the security office and said to Park, change Lily's pickup today. I need her taken directly to my neighbor's apartment, not the babysitter's building entrance. Different route. Don't use the car we've been using. Park looked at him. She understood what this meant without being told what it meant, because she'd been in enough operational context to read a threat shift when she heard one. Confirmed, she said. He sat back down at the access log. He picked up where he'd left off. He was not fine. He was also not going to be less fine by stopping work. And there were still 3 hours before Lily's pickup, and he intended to have something done in those 3 hours that moved this forward. It took him 40 minutes to find it. He'd been working through Marcus Webb's original source files, the raw data, not the compiled summaries. And he'd been doing it the way you read something you've already read, looking for the thing you missed because you were looking for something else. The financial records, the communication logs, the names of the facilitators. He'd gone through them twice before and built his mental map of ARCA's operational structure from them. What he hadn't focused on was the metadata. The file creation dates, the access histories, the embedded author attributions that most people never thought to look at, because they were invisible in the rendered document and required specific tools to surface. One file had been accessed 4 days before Webb died. Not by Webb, by a user designation that appeared nowhere else in the file system, a ghost credential, the kind that gets created by someone with deep administrative access who needs to move through a system without leaving a legible trace. He ran the credential signature against Lumen's own administrative access logs. It took the system 11 minutes to return a result, because the match was partial. The signature had been deliberately fragmented, the way you'd break a fingerprint into pieces. But it was there. Partial matches in 3 locations, all administrative level, all within the past 22 months. He ran the access timestamps against Lumen's employee records. The timestamps corresponded to after-hours access, specifically to a period between 9 p.m. and midnight on each of the 3 dates, during which only one person had been logged into the building's administrative network. The name on the log was not Gregory Voss. Caleb stared at it for a long time. The name was Thomas Rydell, VP of Infrastructure, 11 years at Lumen, 1 year longer than Voss. The man who managed the physical and digital architecture of the company's server systems, who knew every access point, every redundancy, every gap. The man who had, quietly and without any visible flag, been the one who gave ARCA the blueprint. Voss had been the information pipeline. Rydell had been the foundation it was built on. Caleb thought about Vivian in her office, sitting across from Voss in meetings, holding herself together. He thought about how many rooms Rydell had been in, how many decisions he'd been adjacent to, how long this had been running under everything else, hidden in the infrastructure the way rot hides in a wall, invisible until the pressure of something larger exposed it. He was still sitting with this when his phone vibrated. It was a text from the contact watching the school. 4 words. He's here. Side gate. Caleb was on his feet and moving before the phone was back in his pocket. He took the stairs. All 6 floors. At a run. Because waiting for the elevator was 6 seconds he wasn't willing to spend. He hit the lobby at a pace that made the security desk guard half rise from his chair, and he was through the revolving door and into the street before the man finished deciding whether to say something. He had a car 2 blocks over. He reached it in 90 seconds. The school was 11 minutes away under normal conditions. He made it in 7, running 3 yellows and 1 light that was genuinely red, and he was aware while doing it that this was not the calculated precision of a man operating at his best, but the raw animal response of a father who had a very specific image in his head. His daughter coming out the side gate, the yellow backpack she'd carried since 1st grade, the way she always looked left before she looked right because she'd decided early that looking left first was luckier, and a man named Cale somewhere in proximity to that image. He parked 2 buildings away and came in from the north, which put the side gate on his left. He saw Cale before Cale saw him. The man was across the street from the gate, partially screened by a parked panel van, doing what the photograph had shown him doing, watching. He was not drawing attention to himself in any overt way. He had the particular stillness of someone who'd done this kind of watching before, the practiced invisibility of a man who'd learned to be part of a background. Caleb moved along the south side of the street in the shadow of a row of parked cars. He was aware of the school behind the gate, the muffled sound of an afternoon that was winding toward dismissal, the specific weight of everything that was at stake in the next 30 seconds. He came around the back of the panel van and said quietly, "Turn around slow." Cale turned around. He was about 40, with the build of someone who stayed in shape for professional rather than personal reasons, and his eyes did the rapid assessment that trained people's eyes do. Mapping exits, calculating distance, deciding. "You're Thorne," he said. His voice was flat. "You're outside my daughter's school." "I haven't done anything." "No," Caleb said. "Not yet." They looked at each other across 2 feet of sidewalk. A car passed. Someone's dog barked from a window above. "You're going to walk away from here," Caleb said. "You're going to tell whoever sent you that the school is not a viable angle. And you're going to do this because what I did in that restaurant with 6 people, I will do to you alone, right here on this sidewalk, and I will do it in considerably less than 12 seconds. Cale's jaw tightened. "And if you touch my daughter," Caleb continued, and here his voice dropped into something lower and more fundamental, something that had nothing to do with training or tactics and everything to do with the specific kind of man he was when the professional scaffolding fell away. "I will find you wherever you go. I will not stop. I will not negotiate. Do you understand me?" A long moment. Cale turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Caleb stood on the sidewalk and watched him go until he turned the corner and was out of sight. Then he turned to the gate, and 2 minutes later, when the bell rang and the children began coming out, Lily appeared with her yellow backpack and her hair coming loose from its braids, and she saw him standing there and her face lit up the way 8-year-olds' faces light up. Completely, without reservation, with the full and unconditional joy of a child who simply loves the person she's looking at. "Dad." She ran the last few steps. "You're early." "I had a slow afternoon," he said. He put his hand on the top of her head briefly. "Can we get hot chocolate?" "Yeah," he said. "We can get hot chocolate." They walked. She talked about fractions, and about a girl in her class named Priya who had a dog that knew 17 tricks, and about whether it would ever be possible to teach the stuffed elephant to do any tricks at all. And Caleb listened to all of it with complete attention, the way he always did, because this was the part of the day that nothing else was allowed to touch. But behind his eyes, in the part of his mind that never fully stopped working, he was thinking about Vincent Cale turning that corner, about Thomas Rydell and 11 years of buried access, about the lining and how deep it went and how much of it he still couldn't see. He was thinking that Cale walking away was not the end of anything. It was Arca deciding to change its approach. He bought Lily her hot chocolate. He sat across from her at the small table by the window of the coffee shop they always used, and he watched her wrap both hands around the cup and blow on it with the careful seriousness she applied to things that mattered to her. "Dad," she said, looking up, "are you okay?" He looked at her, 8 years old, dark hair coming loose from its braids, a smudge of something that was probably marker on her left wrist, and her eyes, her mother's eyes, the same particular shade, the same quality of directness that had no guile in it whatsoever. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I'm okay." She looked at him for a moment with the unsettling perceptiveness that children had when they were paying full attention. Then she accepted the answer the way she accepted most of his answers. Not entirely, but enough to let it stand, and went back to her hot chocolate. He watched the street outside the window, the evening settling over the city, the ordinary foot traffic of people with ordinary evenings ahead of them. He thought, 3 weeks, maybe less. Then he thought, whatever it takes. Cale didn't come back to the school. Caleb hadn't expected him to. Not directly, not in the same form. What he expected, and what he spent the next 4 days preparing for, was the adjustment. Arca was an organization that had survived 12 years by being adaptive, by recognizing when a particular approach had been compromised, and finding a different angle before the window closed. Cale walking away from that sidewalk wasn't retreat. It was reconnaissance of a different kind, the organization taking the measure of what it was dealing with and deciding how to recalibrate. The recalibration came on a Thursday. It didn't come at the school. It came at Caleb's apartment building at 11:40 at night, in the form of a man who had been living in Unit 3C for 6 weeks, under a lease that Ray Dexter's people confirmed had been arranged through a property management company with ties to one of Arca's real estate fronts. The man's name on the lease was Daniel Fossey. Ray sent Caleb a photograph at 11:15 of the actual person connected to that name, and Caleb sat on his bed in the dark, looking at the photograph for exactly as long as he needed to before getting dressed again, with Mrs. Okafor telling her only that he needed to handle something in the building and might be an hour. Mrs. Okafor, who had the self-possession of a woman who had lived long enough to stop asking questions she suspected she didn't want answered, said she'd put the television on low and not to rush. He took the stairs down 1 floor. He knocked on the door of 3C. The man who opened it was not Daniel Fossey. He was someone who had been living inside Daniel Fossey's identity for 6 weeks, which was a different thing entirely, and he recognized Caleb in the same instant that Caleb recognized him from the photograph. And for about 1 second, they were both standing in that doorway with the mutual understanding of 2 people who had arrived at the same place by different routes, and both knew exactly what the other was there for. That second ended. What followed was not the compressed precision of the restaurant, where Caleb had moved through 6 men with the efficiency of someone executing a plan he'd had 45 minutes to develop. This was a hallway fight, close and ugly, in the kind of space that punished anyone trying to be elegant about it. The man from 3C was trained, not at the same level, but enough to make it real, enough to make Caleb earn every exchange. They went down the hallway and into the stairwell, and Caleb took a hit to the ribs on the landing that he knew immediately would make the next 3 days uncomfortable, and he gave back a great deal more than he took, which was the only metric that mattered. It ended with the man from 3C seated on the stairwell floor with his back against the wall and one arm arranged in a way that nature had not designed arms to be arranged, and Caleb standing over him breathing in the deliberate, controlled way he always returned to when his body wanted to do something less controlled. "Who sent you?" Caleb said. The man said nothing. "I can call the police right now and you go through the system, which means Arca finds out you were taken by one person in a residential stairwell, or you tell me what I need to know and we have a different conversation." He paused. "I'm not going to hurt you more than I already have. That's not what I need." The man looked at him from the floor with the calculation of someone doing a cost-benefit analysis in real time. "There's a man named Harlan Cross," he finally said. His voice was tight with pain. "He's the one running the operational side of this, not the organization's leadership, the Chicago operation specifically. Cale reports to him." "Where's Harlan Cross?" "He moves, but he's been using a warehouse space in Pilsen. I don't have the address." "Who does?" "Cale." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "Is there anyone else in this building connected to Arca?" "Not that I know." "Is that a real not that I know or a convenient one?" The man met his eyes. Real. Caleb called Garza from the stairwell, which was a calculation he'd made carefully over the past 2 weeks. Garza was one of the people he'd decided was outside the lining, not because he had proof, but because the pattern of Garza's behavior since the restaurant had been consistent with someone operating without compromise. The call about Lily's school had come with no downstream consequences that Caleb could trace, and the information had been specific enough that a compromised officer would have used it differently. You operated on best available evidence. Garza was his best available evidence. Garza arrived in 19 minutes and stood in the stairwell, looking at the man on the floor and then at Caleb. "Your ribs okay?" Garza said. "They'll be fine. You should get them looked at." After. Caleb told him what he'd learned. Garza listened without his notebook, which meant he was listening the way he listened when something was real, and he didn't want to interrupt it. Harlan Cross. He's the operational coordinator for ARCA's Chicago activity. If we find Cross, we find the chain that connects back to the organization's leadership. And Cale? Cale is the thread. Caleb looked at the man on the floor. "Can you hold him somewhere quiet while I work the Cale angle?" "Technically what you're asking me to do. I know what I'm asking you to do." Garza was quiet for a moment. He looked at the man on the floor, then at the door to 3C still standing open down the hall, then back at Caleb. He had the expression of someone who had been on the force long enough to understand that the difference between what the law permitted and what a situation required was sometimes a distance that only certain people were willing to cross. 48 hours, Garza said. After that, he goes through processing. 48 hours is enough, he told Vivian the next morning. Not everything. He told her about the apartment, about Cross, about what it meant for the timeline. He left out the specifics of the stairwell, because they weren't information she needed, and were information that carried their own weight, and he'd found over the weeks they'd been working together that Vivian processed difficult information better when it was given to her in the form of what it meant rather than what it looked like. She was standing at the credenza making coffee from the distressed machine when he talked, and she kept her back to him for most of it, which he'd learned was how she listened to things that were hard. She gave them her attention without giving them her face, because her face, once the composure in it shifted, took effort to recover. "Cross," she said, "you think he's been the one coordinating everything since the restaurant?" "Yes." "The restaurant. Voss, Riedel, the contractors, Cale. It all runs through a local coordinator and crosses it." She turned around. She had the coffee and she wrapped both hands around it, the same gesture he'd seen Lily use with her hot chocolate, and the similarity struck him in a way that was personal and quiet, and not anything he needed to do anything about. "And above Cross?" "That's what I'm working toward. Cross knows who he reports to. If we get Cross, we get the chain." "How do we get Cross?" "Cale," he said again. "Cale is still moving. Ray's people have been tracking him for 4 days. He hasn't gone to ground, which means he still thinks his cover inside Lumen is operational. He doesn't know we've identified the contractors, and he doesn't know about the man from 3C. As far as Cale is concerned, the operation is behind schedule, but still functional." He paused. "We're going to let him lead us to Cross." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "And Voss and Riedel?" This was the part he'd been working out. "We move on them simultaneously with the operation against Cross. If we move on them first, ARCA knows the internal sources are burned, and Cross goes to ground. If we move on them after, they've had time to destroy anything we haven't already captured." "Simultaneous. Yes. I need you to trust me on the timing." She set the cup down on the credenza. "I do trust you. I've trusted you since you picked up a phone in a dining room full of people who were too frightened to breathe and told a dispatcher your name and then asked about medical for someone who wasn't you." She said it plainly, not as a speech, just as a fact she was stating because it was accurate, and it seemed like the appropriate moment to say it. "Tell me what you need." "I need Voss to have one more meeting. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. The topic is a vendor contract renewal, real enough that it doesn't read as constructed. I need you to be in that meeting, and I need you to hold it together for 60 minutes. She absorbed this. 12 years she'd known the man. 60 minutes, she said, and I need Riedel to be in the building tomorrow morning. Can you arrange that without it looking arranged? He has a standing review of the server infrastructure on the second Friday of every month. Tomorrow is the second Friday. Perfect." She picked up her coffee again. What happens after? After, he said, this is over. She looked at him with something he couldn't entirely name, not hope, exactly, because she was too practical for something that unguarded, but adjacent to it. The version of hope that a careful person allowed themselves when the evidence was moving in the right direction. Go do what you need to do, she said. Ray located Cale that afternoon in a parking structure on the western edge of Pilsen, meeting with a man in a gray sedan who Ray's camera confirmed was Harlan Cross, by comparison to an identification photo that Garza had pulled from a 12-year-old arrest record. Cross had never been charged with anything that stuck. The record was a single disorderly conduct from before ARCA had elevated him into operational work. But his face was on file, and faces were what Ray was good at. The warehouse was 3 blocks from the parking structure. Ray sent the address at 4 p.m. and Caleb pulled it up on his phone in the security office and looked at it for a long time. He called Park in. He spread a city map on the desk between them, physical, paper, because he was done trusting digital anything in this building until the sweep was complete, and he walked her through it. Cross is using the warehouse as his staging point, he said. He's probably running between 3 and 6 people out of there. Not a large team. ARCA doesn't like concentration. They prefer distributed cells. But Cross will have his core operators close, which means Cale, at minimum 2 others, and whatever documentation and equipment they've been accumulating. Park studied the map. What's the play? Tomorrow night, after the moves on Voss and Rydell, Cross is going to know his internal sources are burned. He'll move to consolidate whatever he has in that warehouse and relocate. We need to be on him before he makes that decision. He looked at her. I'm going to need your best 2 people. People who can move in the dark and follow my lead without committee. Santos and Keller, she said immediately, which told him she'd been thinking about this possibility without being told to, which confirmed what he'd suspected about her from the first week. Brief them tonight. Nothing specific, just that there's an operation tomorrow and they need to be available from 10 p.m. on. She nodded. Then, what about Garza? He'll coordinate the arrest teams for Voss and Rydell. Separate unit for Cross. Federal, people Garza has personally vouched for as outside the lining. He paused. After tonight, I'll have a clearer picture of how many people Cross has in that warehouse. If the number is bigger than I'm expecting, the approach changes. And if it's what you're expecting? He looked at the map. At the 3 blocks between the parking structure and the warehouse, the grid of streets around it, the adjacent structures and their probable lines of sight. Then we move fast and we move clean, and we don't give them time to respond. Park was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. Then she said something she hadn't said in 4 weeks of working alongside him. You doing okay? He glanced at her. Why? Because you've been running on 4 hours of sleep since the school. You took a hit to your ribs 2 nights ago that you still haven't had anyone look at, and you've been carrying most of this alone. He considered a dismissive answer. I'm functional. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. He straightened. I'll be better when it's done. She looked at him with the pragmatic understanding of someone who'd been in operational environments and knew that when it's done was the only timeline that mattered when you were inside something like this. Fair enough, she said. I'll get Santos and Keller. The Voss meeting was at 11. Caleb watched it from outside the conference room on the 6th floor, through the narrow rectangular panel of reinforced glass set into the door. He watched Vivian sit across the walnut table from Gregory Voss, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the comfortable authority of someone who had been trusted for so long that trust had stopped feeling like a thing that required maintenance. And he watched her present vendor contract terms with the focused, professional attention of someone who was fully present in the room and not simultaneously sitting across the table from 12 years of accumulated betrayal. She was extraordinary at it. He hadn't anticipated how hard it would be to watch. Voss had no idea. He made notes in the margin of his copy of the contract. He asked one question about renewal terms that suggested he was genuinely engaged with the material. He refilled his water glass from the carafe on the table. He was, to all external observation, exactly what he'd always appeared to be. At 12:07, when the meeting ended and Voss was gathering his materials, Caleb's phone vibrated. A text from Garza, 3 words. Rydell in custody. He texted back. Hold both. Noon coordination. 2 minutes later, Voss walked out of the conference room and Garza's people were at the end of the hall. Voss saw them. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked past them at Caleb, and something crossed his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the expression of a man who had known for some time that a specific morning would eventually arrive and had spent that time not thinking about it. And now it had arrived, and the not thinking was over. He didn't run. He didn't say anything. He went with Garza's people with the quiet compliance of someone who understood that the shape of this moment had been determined long before he was standing in it. Vivian came out of the conference room and stood beside Caleb in the hallway and watched Voss disappear around the corner with the officers on either side of him. She was completely still. Her hands were at her sides. 62 minutes, Caleb said. She exhaled slowly. Was it obvious how I was feeling? No. It felt obvious. It wasn't. She looked at the empty hallway for a moment. He had a photograph of his grandchildren on his desk, she said. I bought him that frame 3 years ago for his birthday. She paused. I keep thinking about that. Caleb didn't tell her not to. It seemed like the wrong thing to say, that the human details were the cost of working with people, and the cost didn't stop being real just because the larger accounting was necessary. Go somewhere you don't have to hold yourself together for a while, he said. You've earned it. She looked at him. I'll be fine. I know you will. I'm saying you don't have to be for the next couple of hours. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, and the slight shift in her posture, the fraction of an inch downward, the small release, was the only sign she gave. Thank you, she said quietly, and walked away down the hall. Cross moved that night, earlier than Caleb had projected. Ray called at 8:40 p.m., not 10, not after the operation was set, because Cale had made a call from a burner that Ray's contact in Federal Signals Intelligence had been tracking, and the call had triggered a response from Cross that suggested someone had communicated news of the Voss and Rydell arrests faster than Caleb had planned for. The lining. Even with Voss and Rydell in custody, some thread of it was still functioning, still carrying information to the people who needed it before the information could be contained. Caleb was in his car 4 minutes after Ray's call, Santos and Keller already en route from their own locations, Garza pulling together the federal team that was supposed to be Caleb's backup. He texted Park. Moving early. Send location to Garza. Tell him 20 minutes. She texted back. Confirmed. Be careful. He drove. The warehouse was a converted industrial building. Old brick, metal roll-up doors, loading dock on the south face. Small office structure attached on the north that still had lights in 2 of its windows when Caleb pulled to a stop 1 block east at 9:03 p.m. He sat for 90 seconds doing what he'd done in the restaurant service corridor, counting, mapping, reading. 2 vehicles in the loading dock area. The lights in the office windows. A figure visible through the east window on the ground floor, moving in a way that said, packing, not working, getting ready to leave. Santos appeared beside his car window. She was 31, former Army, with a quiet economy of movement that Caleb respected. Keller's at the west face, she said. 1 exit visible from his position. There'll be a second exit through the office structure. North face. He looked at the building. Cale is in there. Cross may or may not be. 2 vehicles means a minimum of 2 people, probably more. We go in through the loading dock, push toward the office. Don't let anyone reach those vehicles. Garza? 18 minutes, best case. She looked at the building. We're going in with 3 people. We've gone in with less. She didn't argue. She pulled back and Caleb got out of the car. The loading dock door was heavy steel and manually operated, which meant it wasn't going to open quietly. He didn't try to make it quiet. Speed mattered more than silence at this stage because silence was already gone. Cross was moving because he knew something had changed, which meant every second was a second the building was getting closer to empty. He went through the door fast and moved left along the interior wall, which was stacked with equipment that had probably belonged to whatever the building had been before Arca had used it for this. Santos came through behind him, moved right. Keller was at the north face. 3 people. The floor of the warehouse was dim, lit only by work lights near the center where 2 men were loading equipment cases onto a handcart. Neither of them was Cale. Both of them registered the intrusion and responded the way people respond when they've been trained to respond, and are also in the middle of being very surprised. Not well. What happened in the warehouse took longer than the restaurant. It was less precise, more physical, the kind of work that leaves marks and costs something. And Caleb was aware the whole time of his ribs on the right side where the hit from the stairwell had landed, a specific complaint that his body was filing continuously and that he was continuously declining to process. Santos handled one of the loaders with efficient competence. Caleb handled the other and then was moving toward the office structure because Cale was in there. He was certain of it. And every second he wasn't through that door was a second Cale was using. He went through the office door and Cale was there, 6 feet away, and also Cross. Harlan Cross was smaller than Caleb had expected from the photograph. He was maybe 55, slim, with the colorless quality of someone who'd spent years being the administrative center of something rather than its visible face. He was holding a laptop and standing near a second door on the north wall that led to the exterior. And when Caleb came through, he looked at him with the particular calm of someone who was frightened and had decided that showing it was worse than the fear itself. Cale stepped forward. This fight was different from the stairwell because Cale was better than the man from 3C, and they were in a small room with Cross in the middle of it and a laptop full of information that Caleb needed intact. He made decisions in real time. Not about surviving, he wasn't worried about surviving, but about managing the angles, keeping Cross from the north door, keeping Cale from getting to the laptop before he did. He took another hit, shoulder this time. He gave back 3 for everyone, and they were not gentle exchanges. Cale went down when Caleb took him from the side. A leverage problem, Cale's weight and momentum redirected rather than resisted, the same mechanical principle that made judo work. He hit the floor hard and didn't get up fast enough to matter. Cross stood with the laptop and looked at Caleb across the room. "Put it down," Caleb said. He was breathing hard. His shoulder ached and his ribs ached, and he was aware of blood on his left hand from somewhere he hadn't identified yet, and none of that was Cross's problem to manage. Cross looked at him for a long moment with those calm, colorless eyes. "You know this doesn't end here," he said. "You understand that?" "I know who's above you," Caleb said. "And the people above you are going to have a conversation with federal prosecutors in about 3 hours because the arrest teams are moving right now and the information we've pulled from your internal sources is enough to end this. All of it." He held Cross's gaze. "Put the laptop down." Cross looked at the laptop, then at Cale on the floor, then at the north door. "The north door has someone on it," Caleb said. Another moment. Then Cross set the laptop on the desk beside him, carefully, like someone who was making a decision they'd already understood was inevitable and was simply completing the motion with whatever dignity remained. Garza came through the south entrance at 9:21 with the federal team. Caleb was sitting in the office chair with the laptop in his hands when they arrived. Cale on the floor with Santos standing over him, Cross seated in the corner with his hands on his knees. Garza looked at Caleb. "Your shoulder," Garza said. "It's fine." "It's visibly not fine." "After," Caleb said. Garza looked at the room, at Cross and Cale and the equipment cases and the laptop and the 2 men in the warehouse that the federal team was processing. He looked at it all with the comprehensive attention of a man who had spent 23 years working toward moments like this one and had learned not to trust them until everything was completely, verifiably done. "The leadership arrests," Caleb said. "Are they moving?" "Simultaneously," Garza confirmed. "We've had teams on the primary target since 6 this morning, waiting on our signal. The signal went out 40 minutes ago." He looked at his phone. "I have confirmation on 4 of 6 targets. The other 2 are in progress." 4 of 6. Caleb did the arithmetic of that. What it meant, what remained, how much of the structure Arca had built over 12 years was being taken apart in real time, across multiple cities while he sat in a warehouse office in Pilsen with a shoulder that was going to require at minimum a week of ignoring it before it recovered. "The laptop," he said, "has Arca's active operational database. Everything Cross has been running goes back through this. Financial, personnel, the lining, all of it." Garza took it carefully. He looked at it with the expression of someone holding something that weighed more than its physical weight. "How'd you know?" "Because Cross grabbed it before he went for the door. People grab the thing they can't replace." Garza looked at him. "You should sit down." "I am sitting down." "Then stay sitting down. Someone's coming to look at that shoulder whether you want them to or not." Caleb let that stand. He sat in the chair and looked at the warehouse through the office window. The federal agents moving through the space methodically, the lights fully on now, the work of documentation and processing that followed the kind of operation he'd just run. The administrative machinery of consequences finally arriving for things that had been operating without consequence for too long. His phone buzzed. Vivian. Garza's office just called me. I can't get a straight answer. Are you okay? He typed back, yes, it's done. Go to sleep. A pause. Then, are you actually okay, or are you saying that? He looked at his shoulder, which was definitely not something he was going to discuss by text. He looked at his hands, at the cut on his left that was minor and had already mostly stopped. He looked at the laptop in Garza's hands, and at Kale on the floor, and at Cross in the corner. Both, he typed. I'll brief you in the morning. He put the phone back in his pocket. Santos appeared in the doorway. Garza's medic wants to look at you, she said. In a minute. He said you'd say that. Then he'll know to wait a minute. She looked at him with the no-nonsense assessment of someone who'd worked alongside difficult men in difficult circumstances and had developed an efficient relationship with their particular kind of stubbornness. For what it's worth, she said, you handled this well. He looked at her. We handled it. She accepted that with a nod. We handled it. He got up from the chair. His ribs made their complaint known in a specific and pointed way, and he incorporated that information without visibly responding to it, which was the only real option available. He walked out into the warehouse, into the full light, into the organized motion of people doing the work that came after. He stood in the middle of it, the way he'd stood in the middle of the restaurant dining room 8 weeks ago, letting the room settle around him, taking inventory of what had happened and what remained. What remained was less than what had been, significantly less. That was enough for tonight. Outside, through the open loading dock door, Chicago went on doing what Chicago did. The distant traffic, the sodium lamp orange of the streets, the particular quality of air that came off the lake, and reminded you, even in industrial Pilsen at 9:30 on a Thursday night, that you were in a city built on the edge of something vast. He thought about Lily asleep in her room with the stuffed elephant wearing its paper crown. He thought about the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that he'd placed on a Saturday afternoon while she directed him from below, and the drawing on the refrigerator with the 2 small figures on the roof and the river in the wrong place. The feeling is right. He walked toward the medic and let someone look at his shoulder and waited for morning. The shoulder took 3 weeks to stop complaining. The ribs took 4. Caleb went back to work on the Monday after the warehouse, which the medic told him was inadvisable, and which he did anyway, because there was still too much unfinished to wait for his body to catch up with his schedule. He wore the shoulder brace under his shirt for the first 2 weeks, and took the painkillers only at night, when Lily was asleep, and there was no one to notice that he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man negotiating with his own anatomy. Lily noticed anyway. She noticed on the 4th day when he reached across the kitchen table to pour her orange juice, and the motion produced a result he didn't entirely manage to hide. She watched him set the carton down and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Did you hurt yourself at work?" "A little," he said. "It's getting better." She looked at him with her mother's eyes. "You should put ice on it." "I did." "More ice." "Okay." She went back to her cereal with the focused acceptance of someone who had decided that the information she'd been given was insufficient, but that pressing further wouldn't improve it, which was a quality he recognized because he'd spent years developing it in himself and hadn't expected to see it in an 8-year-old, and certainly hadn't expected to find it faintly humbling. He put more ice on it that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after she was in bed, and thought about the specific inheritance of character, what children absorbed from parents without being taught, what arrived in them from somewhere interior to instruction. Her mother had been like that, practical about pain. Not cold, the opposite. She'd felt things deeply, and she'd known that feeling them deeply didn't mean you had to be managed by them. He missed her in the way he'd learned to miss her over 4 years, not as a constant presence, but as an intermittent one, arriving in moments that were ordinary enough to have no defenses up. The orange juice, the ice, a practical child telling him to take care of himself. He sat with it for a while. Then he got up and went to bed. The federal prosecutions moved faster than anyone had projected. Garza called on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the warehouse, to tell him that the ARCA leadership arrests had held, all 6 targets ultimately taken, The two that had been in progress on the night of the warehouse operation secured within 36 hours. The laptop Cross had tried to carry out had produced what Caleb suspected it would produce: the operational database of 12 years of organized criminal activity, layered and cross-referenced with enough specificity that the federal prosecutors had described it, in terms that made the news cycle for 2 days, as the most complete evidentiary record they'd encountered in a major criminal organization case in over a decade. Marcus Webb had known what he was doing when he transferred those files. He'd understood that the information he'd spent 18 months quietly accumulating was the kind that didn't just build a case, it ended one. He'd died before he could see it used, and Caleb thought about that more than once in the weeks that followed. The man had carried something at enormous personal cost and hadn't lived to see it matter. That seemed like an injustice that the outcome didn't entirely correct, because outcomes and justice were not always the same thing, and pretending otherwise felt like the kind of comfortable lie that the dead deserved better than. The lining, the embedded network within legitimate institutions, was more complicated. Several of its members were identified through Cross's database and faced their own proceedings. Several others existed in legal gray areas that prosecutors were still navigating months later. One of them, a mid-level administrator at a financial regulatory agency, resigned quietly and retained counsel and was never formally charged, which Garza told Caleb with the controlled frustration of someone who'd spent a career in a system that was supposed to work and knew exactly where and why it sometimes didn't. "Does that bother you?" Vivian asked when Caleb told her. They were in her office. Late afternoon, the West Loop going golden outside the windows, the way it did in October when the light came in low and warm and made the city look like something it was only periodically. "Yes," he said, "but it's not the same kind of bothered as it would have been 10 years ago." "What changed?" He thought about it. 10 years ago, I thought the system failing meant the system was broken. Now, I think the system failing sometimes is what a system that mostly works looks like. The question is whether mostly is good enough." He paused. In this case, mostly was enough. She looked at him for a moment. "You've gotten more philosophical." "I've been getting enough sleep for the first time in 2 months. It changes your perspective." She almost smiled. It got all the way there, which was something that had been happening with more regularity recently. The full version of the expression, not the managed one. He'd noticed. He hadn't said anything about it because it wasn't his to say anything about. He'd just noticed. Gregory Voss entered a plea agreement in the 4th week. He cooperated fully, which Garza said was consistent with what they usually saw in cases where the betrayal had been financial rather than ideological. People who'd done it for money, rather than conviction, tended to have a more pragmatic relationship with their own accountability when the walls came down. His testimony added 3 additional names to the case against Arca's leadership that hadn't appeared in the database. Caleb read the plea terms in the security office on a Thursday morning and sat with them for a while. 12 years Voss had known Vivian. He'd helped write the business plan. He'd hired most of the people in the building. Caleb thought about the photograph on Voss's desk. The grandchildren. The frame Vivian had bought for his birthday. There was no version of this story where that part wasn't true alongside all the other parts. The world didn't organize itself into people who were entirely one thing. Voss had been a man who loved his grandchildren and had also spent 3 years feeding information to an organization that sent armed men into restaurants. Both of those things were real. The law was dealing with the second one. The first one was just something that sat there in the record of the situation, uncomfortable and unresolved, the way certain true things did. Thomas Rydell, by contrast, cooperated with nothing. He retained the most aggressive defense counsel available and contested every element of the case with the tenacity of a man who'd decided that legal combat was preferable to any alternative. His trial was projected to begin in 9 months. Garza told Caleb privately that the outcome was not in serious doubt. The technical evidence from the server access logs was the kind of material that juries understood intuitively, but that the process would take as long as Rydell needed it to take, because that was the shape of his particular kind of stubbornness. Caleb found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't need Rydell to go faster. The case was built. The evidence was intact. The system, imperfect, slow, occasionally infuriating in its gaps, was doing what it existed to do. That was sufficient. He'd spent years in environments where sufficient didn't exist, where you needed complete and decisive and permanent. He was learning, at 37, that sufficient was actually a reasonable thing to accept from a world that was not designed to offer more than that. Vivian announced the restructuring of Lumen's security division in November. It was covered in the business press as a corporate governance decision, a standard post-incident review resulting in expanded protocols and personnel changes. Because Vivian and her communications team had managed the public narrative of the past several months, with the same care she applied to everything, which meant the actual shape of what had happened inside the company was known to very few people outside the immediate principals. The 6 men from Ardent had been prosecuted on federal charges that made no specific mention of Lumen Systems. The connection between the restaurant and the criminal organization, while not secret, had been kept at a level of abstraction in the public record that prevented the story from becoming the kind of extended media event that would have damaged the company in ways the company hadn't earned. Caleb attended the board presentation where Vivian outlined the new security structure. He sat in the back of the room because he'd never been comfortable at the front of rooms that contained people whose primary relationship to the work was evaluating it rather than doing it, and he watched her present to 12 board members with the focused clarity that was, he'd come to understand, simply the way she moved through all rooms, fully present, fully accountable, not performing anything. When she got to the slide that outlined the role of Global Director of Security and its position within the company's leadership structure, she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The decision had already been made 3 weeks earlier in the security office on the 4th floor where she'd come to find him at the end of a day and sat in the chair across his desk and said, without preamble, "I don't want you to leave. I want to make a case for why you should stay." He'd leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "Make it." "You're good at this," she said. "Not the combat part, although apparently you're extraordinary at that too. I mean the thinking part. The way you read a situation and find what's real in it. The company needs someone who does that permanently, not situationally. You have Park. Park is excellent, and I want her to stay in her current role for the next decade. That's different from what I'm describing." She paused. "I'm also asking you for entirely selfish reasons. The past 8 weeks have been some of the most difficult of my professional life, and having someone in the building who I can trust completely, not because I've vetted them or because our interests align financially, but because I've watched how they operate under genuine pressure. That's not something I can replace with a search process." He was quiet for a moment. "The job you're describing isn't the same as what I've been doing." "No, it's bigger. I have conditions." "You always have conditions. I found that your conditions are generally correct." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in the situation that was different from the conversation at the restaurant, when she'd offered him the job the first time, and he'd turned it down before the sentence was fully finished. Then, he'd been saying no to re-entering a world he'd left. Now the question was different. He'd already re-entered that world. The question was what he wanted the rest of it to look like. "Lily's schedule is not negotiable," he said. "Drop off, pick up, school events, Thursday dinners. If those conflict with something at the company moves." "Agreed. I build the team from scratch. Current personnel can apply for positions, including Park, but I evaluate everyone against the same standard." "Agreed. And I won't sit in an office. I need to be able to move through the building and through whatever situation requires it, and I need to be able to do that without explaining my movements to anyone." She looked at him steadily. "Caleb, I trust your judgment. I think I've demonstrated that fairly consistently over the past 2 months." "You have," he said, which was true. She'd backed him at every decision point where backing him had cost something, and she'd done it without requiring the kind of reassurance that some people needed before they could commit to a position. "Then yes," she said. "To all of it." He nodded. "Then I'll stay." She stood, and something in the room shifted slightly. Not dramatically, nothing that would have registered to an observer, just the small adjustment of 2 people who have been operating in proximity to each other under sustained pressure and have arrived, without entirely planning to, at a version of mutual understanding that is harder to build than it looks, and rarer than most people admit. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. I'm going to overhaul the entire vendor access system, and it's going to be inconvenient for about 6 weeks. "I expect nothing less," she said, and left. The foundation was Vivian's idea, and she came to Caleb with it in December, on a day when the first real snow of the season was doing what Chicago snow did, arriving not gently, but with the full conviction of a climate that had been waiting to make a point. She'd been thinking about Marcus Webb. He was an ordinary person, she said. They were in her office, both of them with coffee, the window beside them showing the city going white. He wasn't trained for what he did. He wasn't equipped for it. He was an infrastructure analyst who spent 18 months doing something that took more courage than most people will ever be asked for, and he did it quietly, without recognition, and it cost him everything, and almost no one knows his name. Caleb looked at his coffee. No. There are people like that everywhere, she continued. People whose ordinary decisions have extraordinary consequences for people around them. The waiter who stayed in a service corridor and counted instead of running. The analyst who copied files instead of looking away. She paused. I want to build something that recognizes that, not a prize. I don't mean something that turns it into a competition, something structural. A foundation that provides support to people in difficult circumstances who've made choices that protected others and to their families. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about Marcus Webb, whom he'd never met. A man who existed in the story only as a name on a file transfer and a death ruled an accident. A man who had decided that what he knew was too important to keep knowing alone and had found a way to pass it forward even knowing what it might cost, and had paid that cost, and had been right about the importance of the thing. Call it the Webb Foundation, he said. She looked at him. His name should be the one people learn, Caleb said, not ours. She held his gaze for a moment, and the thing that moved across her face then was one he recognized. She felt the rightness of it, the moral weight of a thing properly named. The Webb Foundation, she said. Yes. It took 4 months to establish the legal structure, the funding mechanisms, the criteria for support. Vivian approached it with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to building the company, not as a publicity exercise, but as something that was supposed to actually work, which meant it needed to be built correctly from the beginning. Caleb helped where he could and stayed out of the way where he couldn't, which was mostly in the legal and financial architecture, and focused his own attention on the parts he understood, identifying people who'd been in situations similar to Webb's and hadn't had resources available when the situation resolved. There were more of them than he'd expected. That surprised him, and then it didn't. People made quiet decisions in difficult moments all the time. The world ran on those decisions to a degree that the world's official accounting rarely acknowledged. The person who reported something dangerous they'd witnessed at work and lost their position for it. The employee who refused an instruction they knew was wrong and absorbed the consequences alone. The ordinary individuals who found themselves at the intersection of something larger than they'd prepared for and did the right thing anyway, without training, without support, without any certainty that the right thing would be recognized as such. He'd spent his entire adult life being trained for exactly those situations. He knew what the training felt like, what it gave you, and what it cost. He thought about people who had none of that preparation and did the thing anyway, and what it must feel like to operate without the architecture of competence beneath you, going on nothing but the conviction that the alternative was worse. That was a different kind of courage than anything he'd ever been asked for. He thought it might actually be harder. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, gradually at first and then all at once, as if the city had been holding its breath and finally decided to exhale. Caleb was in the new Security Operations Center on the 4th floor, fully rebuilt, proper equipment, a team of 9 people he'd assembled and trained over the preceding months, when Park knocked on the open door and leaned in. I've got the vendor audit results, she said. You're going to want to see them before the board meeting. How bad? Not bad. Actually, not bad. She looked faintly pleased about this, the way she looked when the work had gone right. The new protocol is holding. Every access point accounted for. Every credential rotation on schedule. We've got 2 minor gaps in the subcontractor documentation that are procedural, not structural. Fix them before Friday. Already assigned. She turned to go, then stopped. Hey, the anniversary of this restaurant is next week. He looked at her. Ardent called. The manager, Bernard, wanted to know if you'd come back for dinner, on the house. She paused. I think he's been waiting to ask for a while. Caleb thought about Bernard, who had never once spoken to reporters, who had covered for Caleb's absence from the floor that night with a composure that Caleb had never properly thanked him for, who had held the reservation at table 14 in a different name for 6 months before quietly releasing it. A quietly decent man, doing his job with integrity through something that most managers never had to navigate. "Tell him yes," Caleb said. "Two of us." Park's expression shifted slightly, in the way of someone who'd noted information and decided not to comment on it. "I'll let him know," she said, and left. He picked Lily up from school on a Thursday afternoon in late April, which was when the city had finally committed to warmth, actual warmth, not the provisional kind that Chicago offered in March, as a kind of installment plan against the full payment of spring. The trees on the block outside Westbrook Elementary were doing what trees did when they'd been waiting and finally had permission, and Lily came through the side gate in the afternoon light with her yellow backpack and her hair half out of its braids and the particular energy of a child who'd had a good day and was full of the need to report it. "We did a project," she said before she'd fully reached him. "About jobs. We had to interview someone about their job and write about it." "Who did you interview?" "You?" He looked at her. "I don't remember being interviewed." "Last week. When I asked you what you did at work." She pulled a folded paper from the front pocket of her backpack and held it out to him. "I got an A-. Ms. Keating said the minus was because I spelled security wrong, but she said the content was excellent." He took the paper and unfolded it. Lily's handwriting, which had improved considerably over the year, filled about 3/4 of a page under the heading "My Dad's Job" in purple marker. He read it. She'd written about security and about how his job was making sure people were safe even when they didn't know they needed it. She'd written that her dad used to be in the Navy and knew how to pay attention to things other people missed. She'd written that the most important part of his job wasn't the hard stuff. She'd used the phrase "the fighting and things" with the breezy imprecision of an 8-year-old summarizing a complexity she understood existed but didn't fully have the vocabulary for. But the thinking that happened before the hard stuff, when he was figuring out how to make it so the hard stuff didn't have to happen. He stood on the sidewalk outside Westbrook Elementary in the April light and read his daughter's account of who he was and what he did, and it was not entirely accurate in its details, and it was the most accurate thing he'd read in recent memory in its understanding. "It's good," he said. "I know." She fell into step beside him. "Can we get hot chocolate?" "It's 63 degrees. Hot chocolate doesn't have a temperature requirement." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. "Yeah, okay." They walked. She talked about the project, about the other kids, and what their parents did. A firefighter, 2 nurses, a woman who drove a forklift, a man who fixed elevator cables, a retired teacher. And Caleb listened to the catalog of ordinary working lives with the attention he always brought to the things she told him, which was complete, because she was 8 and the window in which she wanted to tell him everything was not going to stay open indefinitely, and he was not going to waste it. He thought, as they walked, about what she'd written, the thinking that happened before the hard stuff. He hadn't taught her that framing. She'd arrived at it herself, from whatever she'd absorbed and observed and assembled into her own understanding of him. Children did that. They synthesized you from what you showed them, from the texture of ordinary days, from the accumulation of small choices that you didn't know were visible. He'd spent 4 years being careful about what he showed her. He tried to show her someone who was present, who was consistent, who came home. He tried to show her someone who thought before he acted, and who took care of the people around him, not from obligation, but from genuine investment. He hadn't known she was taking notes. Vivian was already at Ardent when they arrived. She was at table 14, the actual window table, the one Caleb had taken a reservation for on a Tuesday afternoon a year ago, while Lily swung her legs from the hostess stool, and she stood when she saw them come in, which was the kind of small gesture that said something without announcing it. Bernard was there, older than Caleb remembered, or maybe just showing the year in his face the way the year showed on everything if you looked directly at it. He shook Caleb's hand with the warmth of someone who had been waiting to do something meaningful and had finally gotten the occasion. "The room looks the same," Caleb said. "We kept it that way," Bernard said. "People asked if we were going to redecorate. I said no." A pause. "It happened here. It might as well look like somewhere it could have happened." Caleb didn't entirely know what to do with that, so he said thank you, and Bernard nodded, and that was the complete transaction of it. Lily, who had been looking at the dining room with the focused curiosity of someone encountering a place she'd heard about and was now calibrating against the version in her head, said to Vivian, "You're the lady from Dad's work." "I am," Vivian said. "Vivian." "Lily." She considered. "Dad talks about work a lot less than he used to." "Does he?" "He used to never talk about it." She accepted a menu from Bernard and opened it with authority. "Now he mentions it sometimes. That's more." Vivian looked at Caleb across the table. He was looking at the menu. The back of his neck was doing something that he was choosing not to acknowledge. "That's progress," Vivian said. "That's what I thought," Lily agreed, with the satisfaction of two people arriving at the same conclusion. They ate. Bernard sent out a dish that wasn't on the menu, something the kitchen had prepared specifically for the evening, a gesture of the kind that restaurants in their best versions make when the occasion genuinely warrants it. The city was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lake, black at its edges in the spring evening, the bridge lights on the river, the same scattered lines Caleb had stood looking at a year ago while the room settled around him and he waited for the police. The same view. Everything else different. He thought about what it meant, or rather he let the question of what it meant move through him without demanding an answer, which was a thing he'd been practicing, being in the present moment without immediately converting it into material for analysis. Lily was describing a theory she'd developed about whether elephants remembered music, which she'd read something about and expanded considerably beyond what she'd read. Vivian was listening to this with genuine attention, asking questions that were specific enough that Lily kept having to think before she answered, which Lily appeared to find satisfying rather than challenging. He looked at them across the table. His daughter, who was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes, and wrote 3-page reports about his job using purple marker, and had strong opinions about hot chocolate temperature policy, and was, by any honest accounting, the best thing in his life by such a considerable margin that no second place was worth identifying. And Vivian, who had sat at this table a year ago reading a contract on her phone and had looked up to find the world different from what she'd expected it to be, and who had navigated that difference with a honesty and a toughness that he'd learned over months of working alongside her, was not performance but character, the actual substance of who she was underneath the competence and the composure and the office on the 6th floor. People were not simple. He'd learned that lesson so many times in so many different contexts that he'd stopped expecting simplicity and had started to find its absence more interesting than its presence. Vivian was not simple. She was someone who ran a technology company with genuine skill and also cried in her car after the Voss arrest, which he knew because she'd told him, simply, without apparent need for it to be not true, on a day 3 weeks later when the subject came up and she decided honesty was more useful than omission. She was someone who built a foundation named for a man she'd never met because the man's name deserved to be known. She was someone who asked about Lily, not as social texture, not as conversation maintenance, but because she genuinely wanted to know. He'd been alone for 4 years. Not lonely. That was a different condition, one he'd managed by filling the space with work and with Lily and with the deliberate construction of a life that didn't have room for its own emptiness. But alone. Making decisions in his own head, carrying things without distribution, being the only person in the building who was fully responsible for everything inside it. That was the part he hadn't known he was tired of. Not the work, not the risk, not even the grief, which had softened from its earlier form into something more habitable, not gone but changed, the way sharp things changed over time into the shapes they were always going to settle into. He was tired of the alone part. He'd needed the alone part for a while. He'd needed to be certain that he could hold everything without help before he could trust himself to accept any. He wasn't certain he'd arrived at anything conclusive on that question. He wasn't sure conclusive was the right standard. He thought about what Lily had written in her report, the thinking before the hard stuff. He'd done the thinking. The rest was not hard exactly. It was just the next thing. Dessert came. Lily ate hers with the focus of someone for whom dessert represented a category of seriousness. And then she leaned her elbows on the table, something Caleb had mentioned approximately 40 times without apparent effect, and looked out the window at the city. "Dad," she said, "what's that bridge called? The one with the lights?" "Which one?" "The one that goes—" She made a shape with her hands that represented a bridge in her understanding of bridges. "Like that. There are about 15 bridges over the river that could match that description. The pretty one." "They're all pretty." She gave him the look she gave him when she felt he was being deliberately unhelpful. "The one you look at." He turned and looked at the river through the window, at the bridge lights on the dark water. He looked at it for a moment. "The Du Sable," he said. "The main one I usually look at." She turned it over. "Du Sable." She tried it a couple of times. "I like that." Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. He was the first settler of the city, before it was a city. Was he the one who decided it should go here? He was the one who was here first and stayed. Sometimes that's how things get decided. She thought about this with the seriousness she applied to things that were interesting to her. "That's a good way for things to get decided," she said, with the authority of someone closing a subject. Then she looked at Vivian. "Do you know a lot of bridges?" "Not as many as I should," Vivian said. "Dad knows all of them. He knows everything about this city." She paused. "He loves it even though he pretends he doesn't." Caleb looked at the table. "I don't pretend I don't," he said. "You do a little," Lily said, with the absolute confidence of a child who has been paying attention for 8 years and knows what she's seen. Vivian was looking at him with the expression he'd catalogued over months. The full one, the unmanaged version of whatever she was thinking, which she gave him with increasing frequency in situations where someone else might have maintained the composure. He liked it. He'd liked it for a while without doing anything with that information, and at some point doing nothing with information became its own choice, and he was becoming aware of having made it without quite deciding to. "She's right," Vivian said. "You do a little." "I'll work on it," he said. The evening settled. Bernard came by to check that everything was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was the kind of meal that restaurants produced when they were trying to honor an occasion rather than simply feed people, and then left them to it. The city went on outside the windows in the way cities went on, indifferent to any individual story, containing all of them simultaneously. He thought about the year, the things that had been taken apart, and the things that had been built. The people who had paid costs. Webb, above all Webb, but others too, in smaller measures. Garza aging a year and 2 months, Park's team working hours that nobody formally acknowledged. The hostages who'd sat in this room with their hands shaking and had gone home after and had had to figure out what to do with what they'd survived. Nothing about it had been clean. Nothing had resolved into the shape that stories were supposed to resolve into. The definitive victory, the uncomplicated relief, the sense that justice had arrived with full coverage and no remainder. Rydell's trial was still pending. Some members of the lining had walked. Marcus Webb was still dead. The Arca network had been dismantled, but the human need that had sustained it, the market for everything it sold, the willingness of ordinary institutional actors to be compromised for ordinary financial reasons, that was not something a federal prosecution could address. The world was not fixed. It was only, in this specific instance, measurably better than it had been, which was the most that most efforts produced and was not nothing. He thought that was probably the thing he most wanted Lily to understand when she was old enough to hear it in a form she could use. Not that the world was fixable, not that good people always won, or that sacrifice was always recognized, or that the right thing and the safe thing were anywhere near as often the same thing as comfortable stories suggested, but that measurably better was worth working for. That the distance between what was and what could be was crossed by ordinary people making individual decisions, most of which would never be noted by anyone, all of which mattered to the specific people they affected. That the quiet choices were the ones the world actually ran on. He'd learned that from Webb, whom he'd never met. He'd learned it from Garza, who'd made 48 hours of uncomfortable decisions without requiring a full accounting of why. He'd learned it from Park, who'd shown up at 4:30 in the morning and asked how bad without asking why me. He'd learned it, again and differently, from an 8-year-old who'd held herself completely still in a chair with her hands flat on the table because she'd decided that stillness was the right response to chaos, and who had been right, and who had broken the moment it was safe to. He'd been trying for 4 years to be someone that stillness led back to, someone worth breaking for, someone who came home. He looked at his daughter across the table, animated now about something. The transition had been seamless. She'd moved from bridges to something about a video she'd seen about deep-sea fish, which was a category of animals she'd recently become deeply interested in for reasons she'd declined to fully explain. And he felt, in the particular way he felt things that mattered, the weight and the rightness of the specific life he was sitting in. Not a perfect life. There was no such thing, and he'd stopped grieving the idea of it somewhere in the third year of doing this alone, when he'd realized that the grief was for something that had never existed, and that existing things deserved more of his attention than imaginary ones. But a real one. A life with mass and dimension and consequence. A life that had, as the past year, expanded in ways he hadn't planned for and hadn't resisted, and that looked from where he was sitting on a spring evening at table 14 of a restaurant on the 14th floor of a building above Michigan Avenue, like something that had been earned rather than handed to him, which was the only way he'd ever known how to value anything. Lily was asking Vivian if she'd ever seen a bioluminescent fish in real life. Vivian was saying she hadn't, but that she'd read about them. And did Lily know that some of them made their own light? Lily said she did know that, and that she thought it was the best thing about them, making your own light. Caleb looked out the window at the city, at the river with its bridge lights, at the Dew Sable and the dark water and the spring sky with the last of the day still in it at the western edge, a thin line of gold where the light hadn't finished leaving yet. He stayed until it did,